Thank you very much. We'll be talking about competition as a guarantor of freedom. On the 9th of July, the United States President Joe Biden signed an executive order where he instructed the government to focus on the creation of more competition. The pen that he used to sign the executive order was then handed on to Lina Khan, who is the new head of the Federal Trade Commission. That's the United States Competition Authority. When she was named head of the FTC, and then Tim Wu as a new member of the National Economic Council, and Jonathan Kanter as new assistant, as the new head of the Antitrust Division at the Department of Justice, Joe Biden sent a very clear message. He said he would be using his term of office to strengthen competition. All three of these individuals are recognized critics of the increasing monopolization, especially in the shape of big tech companies. In his speech, he stressed, Joe Biden, that is, he said that open and fair competition is a prerequisite for capitalism to lead to prosperity and growth. Capitalism without competition isn't capitalism. It's exploitation. That's what Biden says. Competition forces companies to compete for their customers with reasonable prices and to offer good services, new ideas, and better products. And to put it in my words, competition increases people's economic freedom, and this increases by increasing the options that they have. A lack of competition can restrict economic freedom. This is what we're going to take a look at in Biden himself. 1/5 of the population has access to only one internet provider, and they pay on average 5 times as much as other people who can choose between different internet providers. No freedom of choice is something that leads to excessive prices, according to this example of President Biden. In a second example, we're talking about the employees' freedom of choice. Every third company in the United States requires their employees to sign non-compete clauses. These are clauses which ban people to go to the competition. Clauses which may be justified for highly qualified employees and that they should not take trade secrets to the competitions. In the United States, however, even employees in less qualified professions have to sign these clauses as well. Construction workers, hotel employees, employees in fast food restaurants. If you've signed such a non-compete clause, then you don't have any freedom of choice when you select a new employee. And this is something that Bill Biden wants to restrict. And this is what he wants to achieve with this new executive order. With his demand for more competition, President Biden is reminding us of the tradition of both presidents. Theodore Roosevelt, who in the first decade of the 20th century broke up the big trusts such as Standard Oil, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who in the 1930s went after the increasing monopolization in economy with a number of different antitrust cases. Now, the whole idea of competition as the guarantor of freedom is certainly not something that you can take for granted. Let's take a look back to the beginning of antitrust legislation in the United States. In 1890, the so-called Sherman Act was passed. This was the first antitrust law in the United States. It was a reaction to the increase in monopolization in the United States, which this occurred at the end of the 19th century, and this was also the establishment of so-called trusts. That's where the name antitrust comes. And then he said that every person who shall monopolize or intend to monopolize any part of trade or commerce among the several states of the foreign nations shall be deemed guilty of a felony. Now, in the first 10 years, the law was not really applied. 5 years after it was signed, the Supreme Court paved the way for a number of mergers where American Sugar obtained a market share of 98%. Instead of this, the federal courts applied the Sherman Act to prevent trade unions from joining forces in larger units. focusing here in industry continued. Around the turn of the century, nearly every major sector was controlled by a monopolist. We had trusts such as Standard Oil, U.S. Steel, trust in railways area, also the monopolist AT&T in telecommunications. We had the Tobacco Trust, the Cotton Trust, Sugar Trust, Rubber Trust, Filmmakers Trust, trusts in the area of clocks, nails, etc., etc. So the reasons for these trusts were, the people establishing these trusts didn't think it was anything really bad at all. They thought that they were setting up a new and better society. They saw this as a superior type of society. It could prevent evil competition, which they believed many people had become victim to. Now, when it comes to the application in the broader sense of the term of the Sherman Act, this didn't happen until Theodore Roosevelt took power. And his predecessor, McKinley, he said that it was the meaning and the purpose of this to have the democracy, have the representatives, not the bosses of the companies, to have the final word. Roosevelt initiated a number of antitrust cases, which led to a number of breakups. The most important one of this, or most well-known of this, is the one from Standard Oil. And his successor, President Taft, then carried this out. Under Wilson, who was Taft's successor, then also increased the anti-competitive rules, and he then set up the Federal Trade Commission in order to enforce these rules. In the 1930s, as a result of the Great Depression, the focusing or concentration of companies increased again. This was something that Franklin Delano Roosevelt observed with concern. He saw that not only the economic but also the political freedom of the population was at risk. In a speech which he held before Congress in 1938, he began with the following finding: "The liberty of a democracy is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than their democratic state itself. If companies have more influence than the elected representatives, then this is a risk to democratic freedom." In his State of the Union address in 1944, Roosevelt said, "True individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence." And that's why Franklin Delano Roosevelt called for a second Bill of Rights, which then should guarantee, among other things, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. He was driven by this conviction, and under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the number of antitrust cases increased eightfold. Just the expectation of being faced with an antitrust case, this had a remarkable disciplinary effect on companies. An example of this would be the antitrust case against AT&T, which was initiated in 1949, and this meant that AT&T decided to take the patents for the newly invented transistor would be standardized and would be licensed at acceptable fees. What they were trying to avoid was the attention of the antitrust authorities on their market share. So this licensing policy also led to a huge boom of innovations. And this is something that drove the development of computers. The breakup of AT&T did not happen at this point in time. It didn't happen until the next antitrust case, and that was in 1982. In the years that followed, we had far fewer successful antitrust cases. The case against IBM was stopped at the same time of AT&T's decision to be split up, and the breakup of Microsoft, which was attempted by the Department of Justice, was rejected on appeal in 2001 by the court. The reason for the reticence of the antitrust authorities and the failure of these cases before the courts was the growing influence of the Chicago School. Borks, the most prominent representative of this school, said that monopolization of markets is not per se a problem, and also antitrust law is not able to protect competition. The only role it has is to secure the welfare of the consumers, which is expressed in prices, the prices that the consumers have to pay. In order to reject a merger, the antitrust authorities have to prove that the merger would lead to an increase in prices. Without proving such damage, mergers could not be banned. Focusing economic power per se, which is something that Frank Delano Roosevelt saw as a risk to our democracy, this is something that the Chicago school did not see as a problem. Now, of all this argumentation proliferated on this side of the Atlantic, the development in Europe was quite different. With the setup of the common market in the European Union in 1989, the transfer of mergers and the control of mergers fell to the jurisdiction of the European Union, and they have more importance than an individual member state, if this resulted in more than one state. The European antitrust authorities had a large amount of independence, and this is due to the competition of the member states amongst themselves. Philippon interprets this in his book, The Great Reversal, in the following way. He says each country wanted to be sure that other countries would not be able to influence the UN institutions to their advantage. So, according to Philippon, the European Union took on a stricter antitrust control, and they benefited from this considerably. And I agree with this point of view. But the European antitrust policy is having a hard time dealing with the increasing market concentration, especially in the digital economy. The big tech companies, the GAFAMs, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, have become more and more dominant in their specific area. Google dominates the search engine market, and Amazon the market for trade online, and Facebook social media. About 120 years ago, we saw that these monopolists were the result of hundreds of acquisitions, some of them which, after the fact, proved to be a problem, such as Facebook's acquisition of WhatsApp and Instagram. A problem because some of them could have become potential competitors. The mergers were then allowed by the antitrust authorities because the startups were not yet generating any revenue. And in some cases, the concerns of the antitrust authorities were ruled out because of fake information. And the data, they said that they could not be linked. They said this was technically not possible, but however, after the fact, it turned out that this was not the case, that these data have long since been integrated. When we talk about competition working is something that we cannot really say is the case. This raises two questions. First of all, in digital economies, is traditional competition possible? Or due to the special features of these digital markets, is monopolization something that is unavoidable? And secondly, what about the domination of these big tech companies for freedom of the users? Is there a problem there? Don't these companies offer wonderful products? And we're all very excited about these products, and it seems at first glance that we don't even have to pay for them. So the digital markets are dominated by a few companies. There are reasons for this. First of all, the specific characteristics of these digital markets on the one hand, and then also anti-competitive behavior on the part of these big tech companies on the other hand. Now, with regard to these specific features, online markets are typically characterized by high economies of scale and network effects. Let me show you an example of the social media. Economies of scale mean that larger amounts can be produced at lower prices than as opposed to small numbers. And if you have high fixed costs, then the variable costs are low. So programming a platform such as Facebook costs a lot of money, but the costs for the development only are incurred once irrespective of how many people use the platform. That's why such an investment is worth it. It's even more worth it the larger the number of users is. Network effects, however, also result if the users have more benefit the more people are using the same platform. Now, both effects, economies of scale and network effects, lead to the fact that such markets can easily tip. In other words, at the end of the day, only one provider will remain, even if this provider is not necessarily the one offering the best services. Now, when it comes to monopolization of these markets, this happens because the big tech companies become more questionable, if not, we could even say anti-competitive practices are being applied in order to expand their markets and their power and move into other markets. Let me give you an example of Google search engines. For many years now, Google has made sure that Google search machines are installed as a standard search machine on cell phones. This means that most people don't even go to the trouble of looking or installing a different search engine. And if you have access to the Google search engine so easily, this means that competing search engines have no real chance to establish themselves on the market for search engines, or they have no possibility to expand. That's why Google has a share of over 90% in the search engine market, which again means that Google has also dominated the online market, the profitable market for online advertising. How does Google make sure that they are always a standard search engine? With Apple, Google simply pays to become the standard search engine. And in other cases, Google makes use of its control over the operating system, Google Android. This is the only operating system for cell phones next to Apple's. And they also make use of their dominance on certain important apps, for example, Google Play Store. And these are apps which the customers certainly want to have on their smartphones. All of this taken together means that we put the manufacturers under pressure to use this together with the Google apps. And this is also means that you have to use the Google search engine and have it installed as a standard search engine. In the Android case, the EU Commission tried to ban this by imposing certain criteria, but they were not successful, really. Google met with the requirements to the letter, but with a new arrangement of the contracts, they were able to bypass them de facto. I could go into more detail on this, but I don't have enough time to do so. But of course, you can read this in my article in the FAZ Daily Magazine. But at the end of the day, new search engine providers, for example, a Munich startup Clicks, have not been able to succeed. And you can see, you have to ask what the problem is. Are the problems of the big tech companies simply very good? Don't they invest a lot for us in innovation? Don't they just decide voluntarily to make use of these services that they can get free of charge? Well, I think I can answer all of these questions in the affirmative, no question. Are these products really all that good? If they are, then why does Google pay Apple to be installed as a standard search engine? You can also question how good the search engine is. If you compare the results today that you got in the past, you will see that in the meantime, you have to scroll down pretty far on your smartphone to come up with genuine search results. In other words, those that have not been paid by those who want to be found. And we also see results that refer to their own search results. And this then would mean people that they would use the iPhone system. Now, the big tech companies invest a lot of money. That is correct. They also have a lot of money to do so. But the big question now is how much do they invest in innovation, but how much innovation would there be in a different situation if there were competition? Because then, if there were competition, they would also try to get new customers, and this means that other innovations would result as well, innovations where you can gain new customers. Right now, innovation is focused primarily on getting the users and keeping them in the paid areas and keeping them in their own ecosystem, and this is not in the interest of the users. Well, how voluntary is your decision to use these services? It's only voluntary if I have an attractive alternative. If I don't have an alternative, as I said before, because the access to the market is very difficult for other competitors, then your options are very restricted. Now, if you want to change, it's only attractive if I change if all of my other friends use the same platform. It doesn't do any good if my friends don't join with me. So this is something that is often not free of charge. And I pay for my data, I pay with my attention, and at the end of the day, I also pay higher prices for the products which are caused by the advertising costs. Now, in order to talk about competition and to strengthen competition in these markets, the European Commission submitted a draft for a Digital Market Act, and this includes a number of regulations which would also be created. In the United States, in mid-July, 5 drafts were submitted to the House of Representatives, and this is to see to more competition. Some of these rules are to strengthen competition on the market so that new providers will offer better products, and then they can then make room for them. And this is something that means that as a user, you can take your data with you. In other words, if you change from Facebook to another social media provider. The problem here, this is what we refer to as portability. The problem here is that you will only be successful if a lot of people change at the same time. And the problem is it will only help to replace one monopolist by another. So much better would be rules that would ensure competition within the market. This can give you interoperability. Interoperability, in our specific example, would mean that if you change from Facebook to another provider, then you would still have access to your old posts and those of my friends. Then I could choose between different providers, and my network effects would still exist. This would be real competition. Now, the European draft does not provide for such comprehensive interoperability. The American draft goes much further. Now, one step further would be not to count only on regulation, but also to split up the big platforms. In the European draft, this is something which is seen as a very last resort. The U.S. draft is much more radical in this respect. The advantage of such a structural regulation would be that complicated regulation and monitoring would no longer be necessary. And it doesn't mean that that would be the end of new, exciting products and innovations if you take a look at the big tech companies today. I, again, showed in a study, and I looked at the last split up of AT&T, which was in 1982 or 1984, and back then, a lot of people had concerns. They thought that the telephone service would collapse. Innovation in the United States would suffer as a result. But just the opposite is what happened. The telephone still worked, and there was a huge number of wonderful innovations, a boom, and this is something which paved the way for the Internet era. At our forum today, maybe the most important effect would be if we talk about big tech companies, and this is something we need to consider here. A split up would also mean that there would be a limit to the political power of the mega companies and their owners. And then to come full circle, that was just the motivation that we had when the antitrust law was introduced in the United States. This is something which says that a very small number of companies control a huge amount of data volume, a huge data volume. How much freedom does a provider have if they only have such a gatekeeper platform, and only in this way do they have access to their customers? How much freedom do I have if an individual company can determine through their algorithm what kind of information I can receive? What options am I offered when I do my shopping? What news can I see? I believe, and my answer to this question is, we don't have enough freedom, and that is why we need competition to guarantee freedom. Thank you very much.